Welcome back after the break. My name is Stephanie van Gemert. Marloes shortly introduced myself, and I think that suffices. I'm a heritage professional and have a specific interest in new narratives in the heritage sector. I think that's enough for now. I've got the immense honor of introducing our two international guests and keynote speakers, of which the first one is Vyjayanthi Rao, who's sitting next to me. Welcome. She is an anthropologist with a firm interest in architecture. She flew in from Mumbai, where she's worked and researched the power of the built environment to distribute values such as space, wealth, privilege, and quality of life. We've heard that before this morning too. She questions the formal regulations in global cities and values the informal responses to such regulations. Vyjayanthi researches urban development and shows how informal structures add to heritage making in the wider urban space, the contemporary global city. She is director of Terraform Center for Urban Research in New York and held lecturing positions at Yale and the University of Chicago. And her immense experience and insights from Mumbai to New York will set us up for a discussion that extends beyond our singular heritage objects and our particular case study of parking garage Kempering here in Zuidoost. Please do give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Vyjayanthi Rao.
That's it. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that generous introduction. I almost didn't recognize myself. And thank you to Imagine IC, Marloes, Jan, Keita, and everyone else for inviting me and to be part of this conversation. At first, when they invited me, I was a bit baffled because I thought, what can I say that would be relevant in this context? It's so very different from the places that I, come from, as well as the places I've worked in. But I have to say that as a kind of interloper, and as an anthropologist, my work is very rooted in field work. So it means being at a site and being engaged with it for on a very long-term basis. But it also means taking responsibility for one's insights and for the ways in which they travel across different contexts. And with that in mind, I prepared a short presentation which really goes through a few, 2 decades of research and fieldwork, and also how my own practice has morphed over time. So I too have moved out of, in a way, out of the university, out of the realm of pure academic research and developing theoretical insights, and into a much more fluid practice that crosses boundaries, particularly that, is values and brings in collaborators as co-participants in knowledge making, which was something that was not, in a way it was actually not even valued within academia, because the notion that when you do field work or when you produce insights that are based on this kind of personal engagement with a group of people or with a community, that you must also be objective. You must remain objective in order to be scientific. So that is where I started my career. In fact, Gloria is smiling here because I'm sure she knows, has been through the same kind of process. But so when I started my dissertation research, my advisors told me, you must not do research in India. And I said, why? Because they said, well, you're from there, so you will not be objective. You will not have distance. And I said to them, well, I'm really sorry, but there's a lot of things I do not know. And anyway, the places where I'm going to do my research are going to be very unfamiliar to me. As it turns out, they were also very unfamiliar to the people that I was working with, because this first project that I will introduce to you is really my dissertation research, which was based on fieldwork between 1998 and 2006 in what was then quite a remote and rural part of India. It was an area that had been affected by the construction of a very large dam. The construction of the dam resulted in the submergence of about 100 villages. And when we mean by villages, they're very large. The population is between 2,000 and 5,000, which would qualify as towns in some countries. And so these about 150,000 people had to be relocated as a result of this submergence. But at the same time, as a kind of pre-submergence archaeological survey revealed that this particular area was actually very, very rich in a kind of a monumental heritage. And this sort of monumental heritage is recognized is something that I wanted to start with this very recognizable understanding of heritage and monumentality, because this is something that we are all familiar with. Any nation will actually be, will be very familiar with these kind of techniques of processing the past. So here are some images from this first project of mine, which took place in a village called Jedprol, in a state, in a now new state called Telangana. At the time when I did my research, it used to be part of another state called Andhra Pradesh. So the breakup of the state itself is incredibly interesting, because now you have the opportunity to spin a new version of the past. What I will show you is, so in the village of Jedprol, these are some archival images. There was a monumental temple which was used for worship by the royal family, or the family that ruled from this village as its seat. And this is an image of that temple from sometime in the 1940s, I believe. And this is an image of the temple from sometime in the 1980s. I'll explain to you what happened in between that image, this and this. There was this heritage conservation project that took place, which involved the dismantling and reconstruction of 100 temples, which would have been submerged by the reservoir of the dam. So the entire project took about 2 decades, from start to finish, from dismantling to reconstruction. And it involved all kinds of very interesting sort of side notes, like this image, which shows a ritual reconsecration of the temple once it had been reconstructed. So in a bizarre way, the archaeologists were doing their job. They dismantled the temples and reconstructed them, but they also paid some attention to what they imagined to be the cultural interaction with the monument. So they were attentive. They were trying to pay some respect to a kind of lineage of ritual connection with these temples. However, what happened, and one of the important things to mention about this project is that it was distinctive because the archaeology department actually decided to reconstruct these monuments in situ. So they didn't, initially they thought they could take the stones and rebuild the temples in, say, in the capital city. So it would become like a museum, but very, very much removed from the place from its original context. So for the first time, actually, in the history of the 150-year-old history of the Archaeological Survey of India, the government decided, which is a government body, they decided that actually it might be more interesting to reconstruct the temples in and around the reservoir. So they remain more or less within the region where they were originally constructed. And the idea was to stimulate tourism, to produce a sense of heritage which had not existed before, because some of these temples were in use and villagers would come and worship in them, but many of them were also ruined temples where no one actually worshipped in them, although they knew of their ancientness and so on, but there was a kind of, they were living ruins, let's say. They were ruins that didn't have, at the same time they were out of the contemporary temporality of the villagers, but they were also very much part of their lives as structures, if you will. Now, what happened after the reconstruction is something I just want to briefly refer to before I move to the next one. So here you see post-reconstruction. This is the temple of the village of Jetprol. It's one of the rare instances where the reconstruction happened within a village that also moved with the temple. But in most cases, the villagers in this region, after the submergence, just left. And they had to, because they had no land, they had no means of livelihood, so they had to leave and migrate. And the temples from those villages ended up being reconstructed in these temple compounds, in which about 20 to 25 temples were clustered according to the period in which they had been built. So here it was a work of archaeology and art history coming together to produce a kind of catalog, a very vivid catalog of a particular style of temple architecture. And basically the message was, that's all we're interested in. The monument represents a particular moment in the past. And as you can see from this picture, from this image which I took, these temples are sadly, completely devalued. They just exist on the side of the road in this kind of compound in a very lonely and uncared for state. The man in the front of the picture is a priest that's been appointed by the government, and he lives somewhere close by, and he cycles over once in a while to light a lamp and to perform some rituals, but he's paid a monthly salary for that. So it's a very coveted position, because if you can get it, it's like, and no one can check up on you because it's so far away from anywhere, right? And nobody comes there. In the meanwhile, during the time I was doing fieldwork, this area was also very much falling into a sort of pattern of insurgency against the state, Maoist-led insurgency, partly because of the damage that had been done to the area by the development project, by the dam, etc. So people were building these kind of monuments, and this is a monument which is a monument to a comrade who was slain by the police in an encounter. These are very common, and at the time when I started doing fieldwork, everything was very underground, but then it came above ground, and it was expressed in these forms of monuments, which you will see in in many villages in India, statues of certain leaders, or these kind of sort of homemade, symbolic structures. So I just wanted to refer to this landscape as the afterlife of the heritage conservation project, where many different kinds of monumentality, start to appear. And people also become aware, because of the project, of something called heritage, which is, I'm not sure, is a category that was indigenous to the place where, certainly where I did fieldwork, but in large parts of India, I would say. The idea of consigning something to a place of significance in the past is not, I would say, a kind of a strategy that's really widespread or rooted in the processes of dealing with the past, certainly in large parts of South Asia, I would say, not just India, but even beyond. Now, I want to shift gears to fast forward to a future moment in which I myself have become sort of, in a way, as I said, began a bit disenchanted with being just, purely descriptive field worker, and have started collaborating quite actively by this point with a number of architects, landscape architects, designers, and so forth. And what I'm going to show you is a short video of a film that we made for a design competition, which asked us to identify certain, or to propose ways of making Mumbai more resilient to the future sort of climate change scenarios. So here, what we were told to do was come up with a design proposal, which would be, which would build on what the sort of latest ideas in sustainability and climate science, et cetera, but myself and the group that I worked with, what we began to, we had already done extensive research in Dharavi, Mumbai, which is actually, as some of you may know, was infamous as Asia's largest slum, and for a very long time. It's home to about 1 million people, and it's an extremely dense neighborhood, informal settlement, but it's, I would say, quasi-formal because it's almost 60 years old. Many of these residents have been around, at least many of the people who own the structures or the landlords have been around for generations. And over time, it has become not just a residential neighborhood for workers who work all over Mumbai, but it's actually an industrial. It's an an industrial. I would say an industrial park in its own right, but mostly with with conditions that are highly improvised. So in Dharavi, as we had done field work, I had done field work in the 2 years before in this neighborhood, and one of my discoveries was that there's a fishing community that was in the neighborhood of Dharavi before anything else, so for almost 400 years, and this fishing community had been sort of pushed back by land reclamation, and despite that, they would take their boats out to the sea, even though the sea was now quite far away. Except for 3 months of the year when they had to, when they had to basically deal with the monsoons and could not fish in the open sea. And so during that period, we discovered that this community had built, I think the video starts playing. Let the video play so we can.
Coastal slums and intertidal zones to address issues of water contamination, distal storm surges, and to provide controlled capture and release of tidal and sea level rise flooding. The dynamics of informal settlements the world over generate social and ecological networks and socially productive infrastructure. These networks and infrastructures can be progressively upgraded to make these settlements more resilient and to create more sustainable urban change for the cities of which they are a vital part. Communities and informal settlements are not only formed by histories of shared cultural practices, linguistic, regional, and ethnic origins, but also by shared environmental risks and ways of making claims on the city. Through systematic and long-term research in Dharavi, an informal industrial settlement in Mumbai, we identified an existing tank and burn system that is currently used for fish farming and community gardening. This people-powered infrastructure at the intersection of the Miti River estuary, the Mahim Creek, and the Arabian Sea could potentially become an engine for resilience against the effects of climate change for the entire city. Dharavi Koliwada is a 400-year-old fishing village at the northwestern edge of Dharavi. Dharavi supports a wide range of industrial activity, including the recycling of plastics and other materials, food preparation, pottery, and the manufacturing of garments and leather goods. These activities create further vulnerabilities and increase the potential for environmental disasters. Koliwada is at the edge of the creek and at the meeting point of two arterial roads. It is home to the Koli fisher community, considered to be the original inhabitants of the 7 islands underlying contemporary Mumbai. On July 26, 2005, the Miti River flooded catastrophically, killing more than 500 people in Mumbai. The estuary continues to be vulnerable to severe flooding. It is constantly blocked by the dumping of industrial effluents from the factories of Dharavi. Within this contaminated estuary's mangrove forest, the Koli community have created and maintained these tanks for more than 30 years. The tanks are used for fish farming and fishing, especially during the monsoons when open sea fishing is not permitted. Small fruit and vegetable gardens are cultivated along the earth edges of the burns, shaped by using the mud dug out from the creeks to create the tanks. The tanks and burns system is currently under the stewardship of the Koli community, and it represents the possibility of creating increased economic value through social participation. Our project redirects this system beyond fishing and gardening. We propose to retrofit the system of tanks and burns with 5 additional technologies.
Okay, so I'll stop it there. And as you can see, one proposal was identifying those tanks as part of a system of heritage that could then be turned into something for the future of not only this community but for the entire city. So one of the ideas that we were really, really keen to work with was how not that the idea of heritage is not localized, but actually becomes global in the best sense of the term, meaning that it becomes a catalyst for change of the entire community. If you imagine the city as a community, which it's quite difficult to do that. Even though a city, by definition, has to be a community that comes around forms of infrastructure. So what we proposed was, what if you take an infrastructure that is invisible for many reasons, right? Both because the Koli community themselves are invisible as actors within the city. They're not considered to be, they're not your go-to experts, right? If you're talking about resilience, you wouldn't go to them. You would go to, somebody who had a master's in sustainability or what have you. And yet what we found was that here was a form of making resilience or making sustainability which has its roots in something that was already going on. So here was a project that was inviting us to think about how can we think of heritage in relation to resilience, in relation to one form of heritage making as focusing on reinforcing something that is already there, right? And not just sort of going and making new meanings for it, but if you do make new meanings for it, then the process has to sort of take people out of their comfort zone, out of localizing this community, into making them like really prominent actors for the city as a whole. So this was our aim with this project. Now I might need some help in advancing to the next slide. Sorry.
for removal and processing.
Are we on the next slide? I did. And I have to go back, all the way back. So you get to go through. I hope the video doesn't start playing again. Yeah, here we go. So the next project that I'm going to show you is moving on from the Dharavi project. I had already been working in another informal settlement in northeast Mumbai, and in 2015. I was invited along with my community of collaborators from this informal settlement to participate in the Kochi Biennale, which is basically India's first Biennale, and it's now in fact this year will be its 4th edition. So we were invited to participate in the 3rd edition of the Biennale. And the invitation came from the curator. It's an artist-curated Biennale. So that makes it slightly different from, the other global Biennales. There's as all of you know, art has become, artistic intervention has become a huge medium for thinking about very, very thorny social questions and issues. And in our case, in the case of India, actually, Indian contemporary art, the artists have not shied away from exploring social and political issues in a very in a very head-on way. And when the invitation came to turn what was essentially an anthropological exploration of the nature of informality and the nature of life in an informal settlement into a project that was artistic in intent and in nature, it called for a big shift in thinking. First of all, I mean, those with whom I had been working, those whose lives I had been exploring as a researcher, had to become, in some ways, co-authors of whatever was produced. And I think this is a struggle that, we're all really engaged in, from what I heard this morning, in that how do we take how do we take the participation of people that we work with and turn it into an event or an object or a process that in which we can all see ourselves. It's not just that we were this project was to bring to light certain aspects of this community, which as an anthropologist I would have done anyway, to serve as a medium, as a revelation of a certain way of life. But moving even more beyond that, it was an opportunity to work with them to produce something that was meaningful for all of us. And this is what I keep emphasizing this term, because I think one of the problems with heritage making is that its relevance remains tied to particular audiences. And the particularity of the audience becomes, in some ways, a point of blockage for figuring out why is this significant, because it cannot be significant only for a small group of people, whether that's people who are interested in modernist architecture, or whether it's informal communities, or it's a particular gender group, or a particular caste community, etc. my interest, I think, has always been how do we make something that moves beyond those boundaries and that can address and that can move people. As we are speaking about emotion and affect, the point is, what is it that moves? Yeah, what is it that moves communities? And this was what brought us together. We called ourselves Samoha, which simply means collective, and it's a Sanskrit word, but also in many other Indian languages. And what that meant is that we were very loose. We didn't have, individual. For this particular iteration, we were a particular group of individuals, but it could be many other individuals who could come and go and enter and leave as they pleased. So, as part of the Biennale project, one of the things that I learned was this. As I'm learning also from your beautiful installations here, the role of media. To how do we harness different forms of media. And this project actually involved a number of different kinds of media. They included an architectural installation in Kochi, but they also included a number of short films that were made by our collaborators in the community. And I'm going to play a couple of them for you just to give you a quick sense, and then I'll end after that, because I think, am I good on time? Okay, perfect. So just to give you a sense, now for me, these films are really important because, before the Kochi Biennale project was seeded, one of our main collaborators, Santosh Thorat, whom you will hear now, was already making films, and he was putting them on his own YouTube channel. So we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to enhance that and to tell the stories of that community and to create even wider reception for them. So let me play you 2 short films, and I think these will convey to you the sense of this community and its achievements.
प्रत्येक माणसाने
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly show you that because it was completely shot and edited by people of who were part of Samuha from Satyanagar itself. So it was a story they wanted to tell. And the story they wanted to tell is that they've been self-reliant and that they have self-built their community, and that that self-respect actually comes from that combination of self-reliance, but that they've reached a point where this kind of daily struggle for what they need, for their very basic needs, actually has become a barrier to moving forward. And what they meant specifically by that is that they, as Santosh says at the very end, the interest in cultural, creative, and spiritual development was something that that could not proceed in this sort of mode of constant struggle and self-making and self-building and self-reliance, and that in fact, a recognition of their heritage as a community, and this is a very diverse community, even though it was settled by, the settlement began through the efforts of one particular very low caste community. It's a very, very diverse settlement of about 32,000 people today, and all of this kind of civic activism which has brought them together, is also allowed them to understand that in the future, they would have to look back upon their heritage in order to sort of advance and make new claims. And these new claims, I would like to leave you with just one thought. All of this actually happens, what you saw in Dharavi and what you saw in Satyanagar, all of this is happening under the shadow of redevelopment, something that I'm hearing next door. This is the sound of Mumbai, actually. I mean, every road, every building, every settlement is equal opportunity target for what is called redevelopment in Mumbai. We had a debate about this last night at dinner, and by redevelopment in Mumbai, what is meant is really demolition and rebuild. So, but it's never a tabula rasa situation. I want to leave you with that because I know that the modernist kind of dream was one that you begin with tabula rasa and you build something on top of it. But the future in that case is like a point where, it's a vanishing point, basically, where it's never, it may arrive perfect, but then what happens after perfection, the afterlife of heritage is what we really need to think about and unpack, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Vyjayanthi. Thank you also for battling through the urban redevelopments around us. That was a very, very interesting talk about the difference between preserving heritage and recognizing resistance as heritage and resilience as heritage. And I love the idea that you not so much speak about participatory, but really showing resistance as the co-authors of your research and what you disseminate. So thank you so much for that. We have a short coffee break now before we start May's second keynote. And I'm going to urge you to go over there, have your coffee, have your tea, warm up a little bit, and then we're going to start here again. Hopefully the sounds will calm down soon. Unfortunately, we can't move because we need the PowerPoint screen. So with apologies to both speakers, but I loved it, Vyjayanthi, that you made it part of your speech. I wish I could say we've planned it like this. Huh? So a short break, and please come back 1:45. So that's 7 minutes you've got. See you in a bit. Okay, welcome back. Make yourself comfortable. Please do sit down. Okay. welcome back. So Vyjayanthi is still standing next to me because there was this feeling, your speech was very interesting indeed. And I'm sure there are a few people who have questions. So I'm just looking around. If somebody wants to ask a question at the moment, later on we have another Q&A together with me, and we can look more at commonalities between the two of them. I see a question over here, so if you can keep it short, we'll have some time for Vyjayanthi to address your question. Yeah?
Martin Verbeet. I'm very pleased with your talk and very inspiring. But in the beginning, you made one remark about the temples and how the local population reacted to that. Yeah. And you said they have basically no binding to these monuments, and yeah. I was astonished by that. So, can you explain it? So, how do you analyze that actually?
Yeah, actually, I think there was gentleman Michael Schwartz. You're still here, and we just had a talk about that, about the fact that I think that in general the attitude towards the past as well as towards the future quite different. I think this is where anthropology really becomes useful, because it does allow us to think about different ways in which temporality is understood. And when you analyze, the reaction that people, or the ways in which people react to these reconstructed monuments, it's very clear that there's, even if they were ruins and they were in their villages before the submergence, before they were moved, they were still considered live. They're still considered somewhat as entities or as volatile objects. And when they're moved, into these kind of museum-like compounds, where they're disconnected from this sense of liveliness, and they become, in some ways, they become more like dead objects, that's when you lose that connection. So it actually becomes a monument with a capital M. And in that sense, I was always astonished, even as a child, at the way in which people react to monuments in India, even those that are, monumentalized, by and guarded by different agencies. There would be just people picnic in them, they deface them, they write their names. I mean, this is stuff that you would never see in many other parts of the world. But I think that is a behavior that reflects a certain connection or a certain way of interacting with the object.
Thank you so much. And I enjoyed that photo with the settlement around it. Is that right, what I saw? So it was one of the temples that was moved, but the residents were allowed to move with it.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that question, Martin. Is there one other question? We have time for one other one, but it has to be very succinct. So, or maybe you can try. Will you try, please? There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have plenty of questions, but I will ask one which connects to the broader theme of today's, because what you talked about made me think of the principles by which archives, very broadly understood, work. And I was recently very impressed by a visit to the Berlin Archive of World Cinema, and how they work, which is not according to the canon, so they don't preserve what the director believes is the most important items in the archive. They preserve what produces collaboration. For example, they have a totally unknown film, nobody knows, but then they have a group of whatever, a movie from India from the 70s, nobody knows it, but they have a group of whatever feminists from India. They are interested, they come to them, they ask them about the film, and they restore them, and not what's most important. And I was thinking about these ideas, which was very present in your talk, of thinking about sort of heritage sites as sites of collaborations and as sites of connections and as sort of mobile sites, which also so the opposite of what you show at the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
No? Which is devoid of people. It's things there with this guy.
Yeah, I thank you for that observation, because I think it's really vital that as we include participation as a parameter in how people imagine heritage, or what people imagine to be heritage, because I think we can't actually throw away the concept of heritage entirely. It is actually vital, because it is something that that refers in a way to DNA, to the things you carry with you, and the things that in some sense can't be discarded, right? But at the same time, it's only the starting point. And as you say, it's very, very important how the archive is created and how interactive the archive itself is. If you're going to put a red ribbon and tie it up, it will become dead. It will become, heritage. It will become literally like the kind of fossil that remains in its place. But if you open that ribbon, and we're seeing a lot of that now, right? Because there's these 50-year statutes on many archives, and some of the most important events of today are actually being rethought because these archives are now being opened up. And I think that's one way in which a lot more people get to participate or get to be part of that process. And certainly, I think in my own practice, that's what I try to show. My puzzle with how top-down archive making, museumization was working, and how disconnecting it was to a group of people that's struggling with their everyday life. With actually being settled in their everyday life, facing demolition, facing threats constantly, how they don't have the luxury even of thinking about their past, of their, where they come from, and yet they know the vital importance of doing that, of presenting themselves through that medium,
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the question too.